Hi everyone, and welcome to our course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Each week I'll do a short video lecture like this one to introduce the readings and walk through the assignments. Here are the learning objectives for the week. At the end of the video lecture, I'll come back to some of these, particularly learning objectives numbers 2 and 4, which you can use to respond to the discussion forum. So with that said, let's get into it. Let's start with reading 1, which is from one of my favorite scholarly books. Samuel Moyn is an intellectual historian, and this book is an exercise in genealogy, which is an approach to intellectual history that stresses contingencies over causation. I don't want us to get caught up in a philosophical discussion on the meaning of genealogy, but the key point, as far as we're concerned, is that there was no single point of origin when it comes to human rights, nor was its emergence somehow preordained or natural. The history of human rights isn't teleological, or necessarily a story of triumphant progress. Rather, it's a complex historical process with many different, often contradictory precursors and legacies. So what I like about this book is its methodological approach, although I don't necessarily agree with its thesis, which is that the concept of human rights, as we know it today, has a surprisingly recent history, really only until the 1970s, he argues. That's not to say that there aren't other traditions of rights discourse that predated this by hundreds of years even. For example, if you decide to read more of chapter 1 from this book, and you only need to read through the first pages of chapter 1 though. But anyways, Moyn talks about the Roman Stoics and Christianity as alternative forms of universalism, which he argues are distinct from human rights per se, which he narrowly defines as individual protection against the state. Now, this opens up a critical reading of human rights history, which centers on the paradox of rights and states. Human rights are supposed to protect individuals from states, but the enactment of human rights depends upon the compliance of those very states. Additionally, and this contrasts with our other author this week, Moyn is relatively critical and pessimistic when it comes to the role of great power politics in the history of human rights. Mary Ann Glendon, the author of Reading 2 this week, begins on this very point, quoting from the 5th century Peloponnesian War, when the Athenians allegedly said to the Melians, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." According to Glendon's relatively optimistic narrative, human rights is said to overcome this sense of political realism. She notes that the Human Rights Project was peripheral in the immediate post-World War II moment, allowing for a sense of idealism that animated the spirit of the newly founded United Nations to compete with the traditional sense of realism that tended to dominate international relations. Now, as a quick side note, as I'm setting up Moyn and Glendon in tension with one another, I want to reiterate this important conceptual distinction from political science. Idealism is about imagining the world as it should be. This was the animating spirit for the Human Rights Project after the horrors of the 2 world wars. Yet this sense of idealism always competes with the opposing tendency of realism, which is about seeing the world as it really is. In the previous slide, I used the term realpolitik, which is about how states act according to their respective interests, which are defined in terms of the material pursuit of power, as opposed to any sense of idealism. And I'll come back to this conceptual distinction later when I talk about the discussion forum assignment. But before we can make any ethical judgments about the past, we first need to understand precisely what we're talking about, in terms of putting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into its proper historical context. That's partly why I chose Glendon's book, because it provides a traditional narrative history of the Universal Declaration, focusing on the remarkable leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. This book is essentially a gendered amendment to the great man approach to historiography. Now, these two readings, Moyn and Glendon, are two different beasts, so they're tough to compare, but I do wonder if any of you all have any initial impressions in terms of favoring one over the other. Alright, reading 3 this week is more of a reference work, as it introduces the core international human rights instruments that have since spawned from the 1948 Universal Declaration. I think of the Universal Declaration like the head of a large family tree, with so many different human rights instruments tracing their lineage back to this foundational document. More importantly, these provisions laid out in the Universal Declaration were eventually turned into legally binding documents via the International Bill of Human Rights, which are actually split into 2 different treaties: the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Additionally, since 1948, there's been the creation of other UN-based human rights treaties, not to mention many more recommendations and declarations. This brings up a key conceptual distinction between hard law and soft law. The international covenants, for example, are treaties, which are signed by states before they become enshrined into the domestic legal systems. Treaties are legally binding. That's what makes them hard law, as opposed to things like recommendations and declarations, which are soft law, non-binding aspirational statements. Okay, so I'd like you all to spend some time going online to explore more of the UN human rights regime. There are plenty of resources online, but you can check out this one from the UN Human Rights Office. In particular, I just want you to explore the range of instruments that are out there. So if the Universal Declaration is like the head of a family tree, I want you to just get a sense of the many progeny that it has spawned. Later this semester, we'll come back to these other instruments. Okay, that's it for the opening video lecture. In terms of the discussion forum, I want you to respond to these two prompts. So after supplying a quick introduction, I want you to first respond to this set of questions. What do human rights mean to you? How would you define it? Where do human rights come from? When were they born? I'm asking these questions so that we can consider any preconceived notions that we're bringing to the table. As such, you don't need to read this week's readings in order to respond to this part. The other part of our prompt, however, is based on the assigned readings. In a nutshell, I want you to contrast Sam Moyne's critical take on human rights with Mary Ann Glendon's celebratory narrative. Which of these two readings do you prefer? Are there any surprises? Anyways, that's it for now. Contact me with any questions or concerns, and I'll see you again until next time.